All right, everybody. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And excited to come back for Tafseer, Tafseer Surah Al-An'am. So let's just really fast, just kind of hover over what we had done last time. وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ صِدْقًا وَعَدْلًا لا مبدل لكلماته وهو السميع العليم. So yesterday we actually went over a couple, let's say, foundations right there. The foundation was really telling us about what really happened to the society and how did they get that far to not even recognizing the miracles when they are right in front of them, when
Aisha,
they come at them.
Aisha, we can
Yep.
see the text on the screen.
Oh, you can't.
You are
Okay.
not
So,
sharing your screen, Molly.
oh, okay. Well, good thing you spoke something.
Yeah.
Good job. And you said something. Okay, here we go. So we would basically go over the previous ayat because remember, despite all those words that the Orientals would want to say that the Quran is not coherent and that there are a bunch of ayat basically after one another, well, that's because they lack knowledge and they are ignorant in Lugha Arabiya to really see the beautiful coherence. Okay, the beautiful coherence is right there telling us, for example, in this part of it, كذلك جعلنا لكل نبي عدوا شياطين الإنس والجن. Every single prophet basically had those enemies. Why? Because if you stand for justice, expect the oppressors to basically see you as a threat, to basically see you as an enemy. You stand for truth. The people that are benefiting from basically falsehood and lies, they're definitely going to see you as an enemy. And they're definitely not going to just stand in a neutral position, because the more ardent, the more stronger you are, the more determined you are in exposing the lies and exposing the wronghood. That's when they will see you as their enemy, because you are simply attacking their agendas, simply attacking their systems, and that's when they're definitely going to see you as an enemy. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lets us know that each and every single prophet had enemies from shayateen al-ins wal jinn, and we talked about the word shaitan. We said they're basically distant. So what are they distant from? They're distant from Allah. They're distant from the path of Allah Almighty. They're distant in their behavior, in their principles, away from the Lord Almighty's principles. They're not just distant in action, but they're distant in vision as well. So that's why they would put in a rhetoric, they'll put in a narrative, they'll put in different words to spew their choices, to spew their system, their agenda, their words, basically in the minds of their followers. And what kind of rhetoric, what kind of narrative? Well, they'll beautify it in order to make it appealing. They'll make it appealing in a way to attract those that within them there's arrogance. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, فَذَرْهُمْ وَمَا يَفْتَرُونَ. If their centricity is basically other than Allah Almighty, if their centricity is their own selves, because they would be living in that arrogance, then you would have to take that position, not always to feel that you have to come forward and somehow you put in all your effort to convince these people, to work against them, to probably dismantle their agenda, etc. Sometimes you have to be a person on a mission, continue your mission, and don't let your focus be on these people and exposing their lies, because their lies are going to be exposed by themselves. Okay, so you would have to work on putting in, let's say, your ilm, let's say your agenda, what you are doing in terms of da'wah, what you are doing in terms of self purification as well. This is extremely important, because many times while you are trying to dismantle, let's say, their misconceptions. Many times these people would be coming in to distract you away from you bringing in a closer relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then they'll become a distraction. I remember when I was struggling with my prayer, and there are some people that were making fun of me. Look at you. When you're praying, you think Allah is going to accept your prayer. No, Allah is not going to accept your prayer because you're bad already. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to accept your hijab because anyways, you basically are not perfect to be able to wear that. It's at all these different things is trying to take you and distract you away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, trying to get you slower in your approach to Allah. So they'll basically try to get you away from Allah. It's really sad when you would see sometimes Muslims doing that, making you feel that you're not worthy to stand before Allah Almighty because you're a person of sin. You're not worthy to stand before Allah Almighty because you're not a sheikha, because you have a lot of sins, because you know that you are being hypocritical, etc. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that there are certain people, if they're a distraction, if they're slowing you down in your pace to get closer to Allah Almighty, فَذَرْهُمْ. There are certain people you just have to isolate yourself away from. You don't always have to think that you have to be the person to be at the threshold of hellfire, trying to keep people away from hellfire. Sometimes you have to protect yourself first before you get into trying to protect others. Protect yourself first. And that's where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, يا أيها المدثر قم فأنذر وربك فكبر. He said, you're bundled up all in that blanket. I want you to recognize, قم فأنذر. I want you to recognize you're a person on a mission. وربك فكبر. I want you to announce the greatness of your Lord Almighty. I want you to recognize it in your brain. And then ثيابك فطهر. And I want you to work on removing all the contaminants off yourself. And I want you to purify your clothes, purify your body, purify yourself. Before you would be a person on a mission, you have to first start with recognizing, what are you doing to your own self? What are these contaminants doing being close to you? There are certain things that you really have to keep away from you, whether contaminants and materialistic contaminations, and talking about drugs, maybe talking about perhaps maybe music and movies and the people that speak ill words and those things. You don't belong around those things. That lifestyle doesn't belong within your perimeter. If you're seeking Allah Almighty, all those contaminants, they should not be anywhere near you. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَلِتَصْغَى إِلَيْهِ أَفْئِدَةُ الَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْآخِرَةِ. Those that would basically not believe in al-akhirah, not believe in Allah Almighty, they'll basically surround themselves. That's why the word litasgha, we said it's basically to lean forward. It's basically to mean that you are not necessarily being tentative in listening, but you're trying to give a listening ear. In other words, you're putting yourself in that environment of that contamination. And this is extremely important. Even if you're probably not necessarily listening to that music, but you just being around that area, just be surrounding yourself with this type of culture, that in itself will take you little by little into normalizing, accepting, and then later on going to another stage, وَلْيَقْتَرِفُوا مَا هُمْ مُقْتَرِفُونَ. So in the beginning, you're probably just surrounding yourself with this type of culture, the culture that is distant away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the following stage, وَلْيَرْضَوْا. Then you're going to get so normalized. You're going to get into this stage of accepting all of that. And you're going to be indoctrinated into this whole system. And without you realizing, you're going to get into the other stage and you're going to start behaving and mirroring the society that you had exposed yourself to. وَلْيَقْتَرِفُوا مَا هُمْ مُقْتَرِفُونَ. So how do I change all of this? You just stand your ground and say, أَفَغَيْرَ اللَّهِ أَبْتَغِي حَكَمًا. Am I going to take any other hakam? What is the word hakam? The word hakam basically means a center of judgment. It doesn't mean a judge, but a center of judgment. What is that supposed to mean? I want you to look at the way that this wording within this ayah. أَفَغَيْرَ اللَّهِ. What are you doing? You're questioning them. When you come from a position of questioning their stances, questioning their grounds, questioning them, you're going up from a higher level. You are then speaking from a position of confidence, a position of determination, in a position of consistency, because you do not get to the level of determination unless you were consistent. You don't get to the level of confidence unless you have these two things, consistency and determination. That's what's going to bring confidence. Confidence comes and your confidence in you setting your feet on the ground, and that's what is called thabat. Thabat, and these feet on the ground, strong and having that Muslim pride, that comes after having the great determination. Where did that determination come from? That word hakaman. You recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the center. You recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is your basis. And that's why you would come in to say, وَهُوَ الَّذِي أَنزَلَ الْكِتَابَ مُفَصَّلًا. You recognize there's no way to get determination, no way to get consistency unless you have the consistency in talab al-ilm, and to recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down the book mufassala, meaning that it contained all the different details. How do you know it contained all the different details? Because you basically got into that ilm. There's no way that you could recognize those details unless you took the time to learn it, unless you took the time to recognize it, unless you took the time to absorb it, unless you took the time to see all of those details to the point that يَعْلَمُونَ أَنَّهُ مُنَزَّلٌ مِّن رَبِّكَ بِالْحَقِّ. That's why we said to actually have that power and the pride of being a Muslim. We're not talking about arrogance, but we're actually talking about the pride to being Muslim. And remember, the inspiration when you say Allahu Akbar, what is that word supposed to mean? Yes, it means Allah is great, but that's also letting you know that your pride does not become arrogance. So you recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is your center, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is your place of inspiration, that Allah Almighty is, this is the word center right there, hakaman, place of judgment, a place of center, a place of recognition. And then that would not be possible unless that وَالَّذِينَ آتَيْنَهُمُ الْكِتَابِ, those that had been that had received the book, those that had basically آتَيْنَاهُم is different than أنزل, because أنزل means it was sent onto the prophet, okay? But آتَيْنَاهُم, in other words, they had, remember this, these arrows, we said this is ataynahum. There is this personal relationship in learning what was in that al-kitab al-mufassal. The word mufassal means that there were details. There were intricate details, and details, you don't learn all the details in one block. You basically learn it in small fragments, small pieces, little by little, for you to basically process those ideas and then have a bigger picture. So وَالَّذِينَ آتَيْنَهُمْ يَعْلَمُونَ. Here goes that word. How do we get the confidence? How do we get the determination? How do we get the consistency? Well, it takes time to get in consistency with talab al-ilm, and that brings in the determination, and that's what يَعْلَمُونَ أَنَّهُ مُنَزِّلٌ مِّن رَبِّكَ بِالْحَقِّ. To know that it is the truth, that's when confidence comes in. فَلَا تَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْمُمْتَرِينَ. So don't be amongst those that would get into the debate. But actually, the word mumtareen doesn't necessarily mean to just debate alone, but it means they're basically the people that would have a centricity of either their own arrogance or a cult or a person. Well, whether it's a person or a cult, in other words, even when you would come and lay out the evidence for them, they're not even looking at the evidence, because to them, the truth is not their area of focus. The area of focus is either on themselves. If it doesn't fit my place of benefit, my place of interest, then I'm not going to take it. And therefore, all the evidence that you're probably laying out for them, they're not even listening to the evidence. They're just looking at themselves as being the center of truth, or perhaps maybe the lifestyle that they're living. It's like, no, it does. That's one of the, I would say, stupidest Arguments that Orientalists, or basically the anti-Muslim, the anti-Muslim groups would say, well, yeah, Islam is going to be chopping people's hands. And you're just wondering, what do you mean chopping people's hands? You do recognize that corporal punishment is only to be applied on criminals. Unless you don't recognize that, why are you thinking that Islam is going to be chopping people's hands or doing corporal punishment unless you recognize that you're committing a crime and feel offended already by those that are against your crime? And then therefore, you feel that you're the one that's being targeted. But if you are not a criminal, then why do you feel so offended by this? And that's to let you see how, the ones that would be offended by justice are the ones that are oppressors. Just keep that one in mind. The ones that are oppressors are the ones that are going to be mostly offended by any call to calling people to stand against injustice. So right now you're seeing, for example, even on American university campuses, they're basically Western, but basically European and even American campuses, even if somebody is looking like a complete liberal, has nothing to do with Islam, okay? Just by standing and rallying for Palestine, they'll say you're supporting terrorist groups. Wait a minute, I thought you said terrorist groups were supposed to be Islamic groups. So yeah, they'll basically, just to stand in support of Palestine right now, they're seeing that that's standing in support of terrorist groups, because supporting Israel to them, basically, at least to the American right now policy, is basically part of its own agenda, because they recognize that imperialist hegemony is in their favor. And anybody that would stand against the imperialist agenda that they are supporting is somehow being a terrorist, is somehow supporting those that are fighting for justice. And right now, according to Netanyahu and people like Trump and people that support them, that those that would stand against their agenda is basically a dangerous thing, and basically trying to dismantle their agendas, and anybody that would rally against their agendas, they're going to label them as, yes, terrorists, or perhaps even their target, and etc. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, stand your ground. Don't necessarily think that it's an issue of trying to put forward the right argument. These people are not necessarily looking for the right argument. These people may actually be looking for their interest and not a particular argument. So you have to know who and how to bring forth, whether we're speaking about evidence or whether we're speaking about argument or whether we're speaking about battles or whatever it is. You have to recognize who the person and the people in front of you are. It's not always lack of argument. Sometimes it's lack of power. Sometimes it's lack of position. And sometimes part of the argument is to stay silent. Listen to this one. Sometimes to debate someone is to stay silent, because if their argument is in itself containing all the discrepancies and containing all the contradiction and containing all the falsehood that is so exposed, and you're finding yourself trying to prove it to them, even though it is so obvious, the best thing to do is just stay silent. And that's letting those liars just know that your argument is too trivial for me to respond to it. It's too obviously clear that it's blasphemy, that I'm just going to let you get nothing but my back and my silence to tell you that I'm not going to even respond to this, and let you know that you had been exposed in your intention. فَلَا تَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْمُمْتَرِينَ. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that you don't become part of these people that would argue. It's just telling you, just like it told you right there, فَذَرْهُمْ وَمَا يَفْتَرُونَ, this is actually completing the sentence right there. If you don't turn your back on them, then you had become part of that discussion and that argument, because you didn't take the position to recognize which battle to engage in and which battle to just completely avoid, and which battle to completely just not even engage in. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, your ignorance in recognizing which positions to take can sometimes include you in al-mumtarin. You can sometimes be within this field of losing your position, and let's use a different word, of giving Islam really the wrong position. Why? Because you at that moment are resembling Islam. And since you at the moment are resembling Islam, by you staying within that field where they are just dragging you to their mud puddles, then you're just really part of the mumtarin. Islam is asking you to be wise in which corners you put yourself in. Islam wants you to be wise. This isn't just in defending Islam, but that's the same thing at a personal level. Not because someone is responding to you on social media or someone is saying something, or even if it's in probably, I don't know, people in your community, in your masjid, in your neighborhood or whatever. Not every single battle that you probably might be facing or someone is trying to attack you in. Only an immature person would think that every single battle that's coming at them, that they would feel that they have they would have to have what is the word that I could use? They would have to have the power and channel their energy within that corner. There are certain areas that you just have to completely dismiss, even if it's a battle that you could win. Because at the end, even if it's a battle that you are capable of winning, if you don't recognize that even these battles that you are capable of winning, that there's going to be dragging and emptying and certainly going to be wasting your energy. So Islam wants you to recognize and be mature and recognize where you should dedicate your energy in. What is a position that is worth your energy? Don't get wasted in arguments. Don't get wasted in areas where people don't even use their mind to think of the evidence, and all they're focused on is their arrogance. وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ صِدْقًا وَعَدْلًا. You recognize your foundation and recognize that the word of the Lord Almighty's word had been completed. It contained within it all the truth, contained within it justice, and there's no change in truth. In other words, if they continue to keep changing their parameters, their definitions, and that's one thing that you would see in feminism, they'll have all these different definitions, and there's a wave, the first wave and the second wave and third wave, and they keep on changing things. And you would see the same thing with postmodernism. All these different isms right there, each and every single time. Let's create a new definition. Let's create a new way to bring in a new narrative. Let's create a new culture. Let's create a new indoctrination. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, there's no change in the word of truth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala delivers. There's no change in it. Because truth is truth. There's no change. The second you keep changing, that's to let you know that you are putting in different methods to cover up the discrepancies and cover up the gaps and cover up the contradictions within the first philosophy. And then you start changing it because you recognize, oh, there's a gap here. So you start just really changing that patch and what it's covering. But there's a huge hole that one patch is not capable to cover. So whenever I would expose one area and that gap in it, you just take that same patch and just use it to cover another area. But the hole is really big. Just by putting the patch on a different hole and in a different on a different discrepancy, it doesn't mean that the hole in that discrepancy or that contradiction or that fault is not there. It just means you just move that patch. Moving the patch doesn't take it away. It just proves that you're just right there, wanting to be blinded from seeing the wrong and all those wrong things within your statement. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ. He's all hearing and all knowing. And therefore, he is hearing what their statements are containing. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting you know, stand your grounds. kalimatu rabbik. And we talked about the open path. Tammat kalimatu rabbik. The Lord Almighty's words, right now, they're complete. They had been ordained. They had been right there delivered. So it was one, tammat, and it was delivered, and it was complete. Two, tammat, to basically mean that it was the word of the Lord Almighty that basically gets the final stage. In other words, all those different words and all those different statements and all those different definitions, just know that the Lord Almighty's definition is going to be the final definition. So recognize that truth is not going to go into different stages of development. It's final. And 1 second. Then the ayah basically takes us, وَإِن تُطِعْ أَكْثَرَ مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ, because that's an area that they will try to use and say, well, everybody believes so. In other words, using another tactic, not the argument tactic now. No, they're using another one. The other tactic right now that they are trying to use is trying to bring in more and more people to believe in their argument and indoctrinating more and more people, because they are trying to create facts on ground. They're trying to create the facts even when they cannot prove the facts. And this is extremely important. This tactic, when you cannot prove the fact, and then trying to recreate by trying to indoctrinate more and more people and trying to say, well, we've got these many supporters, we've got these many people that believe in this idea. That does not change the truth. Just because an idea became culturally accepted or perhaps accepted by a certain group of people, it does not necessarily change the truth of the matter, that it is actually falsehood. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِن تُطِعْ أَكْثَرَ مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ يُضِلُّوكَ. If you were to follow most of the people on earth, they would take you away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's guidance. In other words, they would misguide you away from the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ. Why? Because they would follow speculation. وَإِنْهُمْ إِلَّا يَخْرُصُونَ. And they would be taking these fragments after fragments, and then they would think that it's basically a coherent idea. The truth of the matter is that they took these pieces of fragments and then they put them together, thinking that it gives them a complete and a good coherent statement, or perhaps a very tangible argument. But the truth of the matter is that inhum illa yakhrusun. It's basically lies. And you want to remember one thing, is that the worst of the lies are the lies that contain some truth. That's the worst of the lies. So they'll basically, in our modern times, okay, they'll basically use different words that may contain some truth, maybe in a study there and a study here, and then they'll tell you this is what this report says and that report says this and studies say this. And what we are most of the times not recognizing is that a lot of these so-called studies are not studies that are objective, but they're actually studies that were to defend a certain agenda. So don't be fooled by the word studies say. Just keep in mind that a lot of these so-called studies, they're basically institutions, think tanks, many times basically there to bring about an appearance, okay? An appearance of an organization, nonprofit organization that looks like it's a think tank, or at least it's a research organization. But the truth of the matter is that it's an organization that is funded And certainly it is basically going back to a certain ideology or a certain political group. And then this political group would form this organization that looks like a research group, but this research group was just designed in order to bring in studies, quote unquote, to support basically their agenda. And this is extremely dangerous because what we are not recognizing is, I'll tell you, St. Catherine University, the university I used to work in, okay? They got this grant. It was a large number. It was like, I think it was like 2 million something, okay? But these groups were actually the LGBT groups, okay? Now, St. Catherine University is a Catholic and founded by nuns, okay? It's a Catholic university founded by nuns, but then we know that Catholicism stands against LGBT, but of course the American Catholicism, of course, was hijacked literally by the LGBT, and of course they needed the funding, so it was okay to give up on some of their principles. At least that's how they saw it. Give up on their principles because they were basically in deficit with an amount of money, and the LGBT were saying, hey, we'll give you this much money if you are to support the programs that we would like you to do on campus. So what do these programs look like? Well, these programs, they're anti-bullying. Sounds very nice. I mean, who's pro-bullying, right? Nobody would be pro-bullying. In support of women's rights, in support of people's orientation. Well, sounds really nice. I mean, who would want to force things onto people? Who would want to support misogyny, and who would want to support? So it sounds very appealing. It sounds very appealing that we're anti-bullying, we're not pro-bullying. It sounds very appealing, very nice. Who would want to see somebody bullied and and support the bully, right? But what it really contains is basically all the different agendas that they wanted this university to stand for, which basically is nothing but in support of their agenda. So, of course, they wanted the money. So to them, well, at least we get the money. And it would make it seem like we're doing a lot of activities, even if it's an activity that would support basically their agenda. At least we get the money. And our campus, anyways, we've got these rooms, we've got these halls, and we can have them come in and do these classes, and we can tell the students that if they were to join these classes, they would get credit for it. And by giving them the credits, we're giving them credits. Hey, at the end, we're giving them these credits, but we're also getting the money. So we're getting, for these credits, we're basically getting millions of dollars. Hey, worth it. And that's what really happens. For example, not only in St. Catherine University, but trust me, each and every single campus. That's why right now you're seeing American institutions, they would be called educational organizations, but the truth of the matter is that they're actually business. They're literally business. And you got to be really careful from being dragged into these business institutions and actually thinking that they're presenting knowledge, studies, and Islam tells you, you got to wake up. Islam tells you, you got to wake up because the Lord Almighty had already given you one. تمت كلمة ربك صدقا وعدلا. The Lord Almighty's words contain the truth, and they contain the definition of justice just by creating a redefinition and redefining what makes female, what makes male, what makes truth, what makes family, what makes rights and responsibilities, what makes human, what makes all of these different things. Just by creating a narrative that sounds appealing, it doesn't change the truth. It doesn't change the truth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically created this world in. It certainly does not redefine or even change the truth of the matters of things. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, إِنَّ رَبَّكَ هُوَ أَعْلَمُ مَن يُضِلُّ عَن سَبِيلِهِ For your Lord Almighty knows who is going astray from his path. Why going astray from the path? What is going astray? What does it mean for going to go astray? What is go astray? Well, there's the Prophet ﷺ, he drew a line, and this is really important. He drew a line, and this line is a straight line. And then he drew different lines on the side, and he said, this is the path to the Lord Almighty, and therefore all the other paths are basically the paths to shaitan. In other words, yeah, they may seem really close. They may seem like they're going in parallel with a straight line, but the truth of the matter is that the differences between this line and that line, you may think that, oh, it's completely different. It doesn't contain the same thing. It may be called Christianity, may be called atheism, it may be called feminism, it may be called existentialism, it may be called liberalism, blah, 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 all these different things. But the truth of the matter is that regardless of how different it may appear, the truth of the matter is that if it's not the truth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had assigned, then it's going to be falsehood. وَهُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِالْمُهْتَدِينَ. And he knows who the people that are following guidance are. Now watch you look at this one. هو أعلم بالمهتدين. Then it goes فَكُلُوا مِمَّا ذُكِرَ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ. But before that, I wanted to go to Tafseer al-Qurtubi really quick and actually talk about a number of different things. We'll say وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ صِدْقًا وَعَدْلًا, or actually وَالَّذِينَ آتَيْنَاهُمُ الْكِتَابَ. Is that no, hold on. Okay, no, we didn't do this one. أَفَغَيْرَ اللَّهِ أَبْتَغِي حَكَمًا. And he said, this is actually talking about il-hakam, meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that is the ruler, the one that is the center. And therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent al-kitab al-mufassal. He had sent the details in the book, meaning in the Quran. And this al right there that you would see in this one is called al-ahdiyya. It's basically the specifying al and speaking about the Quran. It's similar to وَالَّذِينَ آتَيْنَهُمُ الْكِتَابِ. So this is basically when you talk about وَالَّذِينَ آتَيْنَهُمْ الْكِتَابِ, it's a little different because this al-kitab, even though this is al-kitab and this is al-kitab, but وَالَّذِينَ آتَيْنَهُمُ الْكِتَابِ within the context, that would actually speak about the Christians and the Jews, meaning the previous scriptures. But within this context, أنزل الكتاب مفصلا, that would basically speak about the Quran itself. Okay, some scholars actually said, well, this was referring to a specific group. So it was وَالَّذِينَ آتَيْنَهُمُ الْكِتَابَ يَعْلَمُونَ أَنَّهُ مُنَزَّلٌ مِّن رَبِّكَ بِالْحَقِّ. During that time, was this necessarily speaking and referring to a specific group, or was this giving me a statement regardless of the time and place? And in other words, al-ibra fil umum, and basically that the theme is in the generalization and the comprehensive statement and not necessarily in the specific story onto who it was referring to at the time. Okay, and that's why العبرة بعموم اللفظ لا بخصوص السبب. But at the same time, some scholars actually said that there was a reason and that there were some people that this ayah was referring to. So some scholars actually said that this was referring to Salman al-Farisi, Suhaib al-Rumi, and Abdullah ibn Salam. What is the common thing about these three figures? Salman al-Farisi was previously one, in the beginning of his life, he was a Zoroastrian. Zoroastrianism at the time was actually a magnificent civilization. It was the Persian Empire's faith. That was Zoroastrianism. What did they worship? Well, they worshiped fire, but they also related to stars as well as having some relationship with their faith, etc. Okay, Suhaib al-Rumi was originally Arabi from Iraq, but the Byzantine Empire, you want to look at this. History repeats itself, okay? The Arabic tribes that were living in the Arabian Peninsula, including Iraq, okay, they were colonized by the Byzantine Empire at times and by the Persian Empire at other times. So the Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire, those were the big civilizations, and the Arab, of course, whenever they needed a job or they needed basically money, income, whoever pays best is who they're going to be supporting. So if, let's say, the Byzantine Empire was needing troops and they were willing to pay for those Arab tribes, they are, hey, the Byzantine Empire is paying us for this, so they'll basically fight on behalf of the Byzantine Empire, basically as a means of income, okay? And sometimes they wouldn't necessarily fight, because if they would be considered as part of the Byzantine, or let's say if it's the Byzantine Empire, and certainly they were within the Byzantine territory, then prepare yourself to get invaded by the Persian Empire. So right now, if you're under basically the territory that belongs to, or at least colonized by the Byzantine Empire, and you are basically living within that territory, and certainly now within that territory, it's basically what the Persian Empire would see as an enemy. So prepare to get invaded. So that's what happened, okay? Suhaib al-Rumi was actually under the area that was controlled by the Persian territory. He was in Iraq, okay? In other words, he was Arabi. But this territory that was under Persian Empire was invaded by the Byzantine Empire. So, of course, when these armies would invade, they wouldn't just invade looking for resources, because humans can become resources for them too at the time. So what would they do? Just like today, there's sex trafficking, okay? And that's the same thing. They would basically take boys, women, whoever their hands could, hold and kidnap, and then they would take them as slaves, and then they would take them to their territory. Now that's the bad luck for Suhaib al-Rumi, and that's what happened to him. He was a young boy, and he was basically kidnapped and taken as a slave in the area of the Byzantine Empire. So, of course, if it's a young child, okay, they are basically going to be surrounded by Aramaic as the language that they spoke there. So his Arabi was not the greatest, okay? His Arabi later on, actually, maybe I jumped too fast, okay? Because Suhaib al-Rumi was later bought by some Arab, okay? And he was brought to Mecca, okay? But here's the thing, is that Suhaib al-Rumi, Abdullah ibn Jad'an, who was considered a main chieftain in Mecca, he was not Muslim, okay? Abdullah ibn Jad'an was hurt to see Suhaib al-Rumi, a young boy, basically in slavery. So he bought him and freed him, okay? So Suhaib al-Rumi, later Umar ibn al-Khattab would comment on Suhaib al-Rumi that he's Arab, but yet can't even speak proper Arabic. Okay, why? Because he was called Suhaib al-Rumi not because he was Rumi, not because he himself was, European looking and appearance. No. He was actually Arab, but he was kidnapped. Just had, I guess, the wrong person at the wrong time. But then later on, he was the right person. If he had not been kidnapped, perhaps, and he didn't go through all of that, he would have probably never met the Prophet. Just think of that. Sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will put you in these different circumstances to help you basically be in this area to find and be the da'iyah. Yesterday I was giving a lecture at prison, okay? And they were 3 girls, basically. Well, girls, women. All right. One of them was African American. The other one was, I don't know, she probably was from maybe, I don't know, Guinea, maybe Liberia, one of those countries. Definitely had the appearance of one of those countries and even the accent. Okay. And the third one was Somali, who happened to speak Arabic as well. So she spoke English and Arabic as well, and definitely knew how to read the Quran, definitely knew how to read and understand Arabic, or even learn how to teach some things about Islam. All right. And subhanAllah, the other 2 girls, they said they didn't know how to read the Quran and they needed help. And then they didn't know about that other girl. And of course, the classes that I would be giving are like once a week, once a month, depends on their the availability and all of that. But then, subhanAllah, I had to call that girl a shaykha. And I said, listen, you're right now considered the shaykha within this prison. So recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put you there to be the person to use that potential to give da'wah, to these girls that don't know how to do their salah, that don't know how to read the Fatiha, that are really wanting to hear what Ayat al-Kursi sounds like. That's it. They just want to know, what does Ayat al-Kursi sound like? What does al-Fatiha sound like? Can you help me learn how to say Subhanallah, or tell me how to say the dhikr, or etc.? And the other person has it. So now we would have to just say sometimes, why am I here? What can I do with my potentials to make a change? Okay, let's see. And Suhaib al-Rumi, subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just like Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, if he was not thrown in that well by his brothers, he would have probably never made it to Egypt. If he was not in that prison or in that cell, probably never made it to be the center, or perhaps the one to be called by the king to interpret the dream. And certainly Abdullah ibn Salam. Abdullah ibn Salam was rather different. Abdullah ibn Salam was Jewish. In fact, he wasn't just any random Jew. He was, his name was Hussein. Okay. And he wasn't just any random Jew. He was actually a rabbi. So he was an educated rabbi. And mind you, okay, at the time, the ones that had the education were actually the Jews. And that's why the Arab, the Aus and the Khazraj, they would send their children to the Jewish yeshivas to get an education there. And that's why many of them were basically turning into Judaism. And there was an ayah revealed just on that, because they wanted, when their families had become Muslim, they wanted to force their children who they had sent to the yeshivas and had become Jewish, because they put them in those schools. At the time, they didn't care. They just wanted them to get an education and possibly, maybe in the future, be businessmen that knew and got the right education to basically be successful within the family. That's what they were hoping. But then their children were affected by that education. And that's when their parents had become Muslim, they were taking their children out of those yeshivas. Yeshivas are basically religious schools, Jewish religious schools. Okay. They were taking them out of the yeshivas, and they're like, okay, now you're going to become Muslim. I said, no, we're not going to. We're not going to become Muslim. Why not? Because they were already taught within these Jewish schools that, no, we're not going to be. So that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed a number of different ayat, telling them you cannot force them to become Muslim. That's something that they have to let their own will decide and determine. So Abdullah ibn Salam, when he had become Muslim, well, he was already a rabbi, but when he had become Muslim, his own people, they didn't know that he had become Muslim. So they said, yeah, there's no way that he would become Muslim. So the Prophet ﷺ had told Abdullah ibn Salam to hide behind a curtain, and then he would basically ask the Jews that were there, what if Abdullah ibn Salam approves what I had said? They said, yeah, well, of course he wouldn't do that. No, that absolutely not. And then Abdullah ibn Salam comes out of from behind a curtain and basically tells them that Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah Rasulullah, I testify that what he is saying is actually true and that he's a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's when they denounced him entirely and they said, he's not even amongst us. He's not part of us. He was never, anyways, a person of integrity or a person of knowledge, anyways. So what else is new? No, you can't prove your evidence, even if you bring Abdullah ibn Salam right there. And يَعْلَمُونَ أَنَّهُ مُنَزَّلٌ مِّن رَبِّكَ بِالْحَقِّ. They would know that the Quran was revealed by truth or in truth. In terms of what? Like al-haq, what are we talking about? مُنَزَّلٌ مِّن رَبِّكَ بِالْحَقِّ. Now here, some scholars actually said in terms of the promise, in terms of Judgment Day, in terms of all the different things, the details that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned in terms of Jannah, Nar, all of that's basically all truth. فَلَا تَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْمُمْتَرِينَ. Don't be amongst those that would shakin. Al-mumtarin, he said it would basically refer to the people that would be living in doubt. So mumtarin, to be in doubt, according to this interpretation. According to other interpretations, mumtarin is basically to be the person living in debating truth and engaging in falsehood. Okay, debating truth. In other words, you're trying to stand against truth and basically right there getting into that debate. In other words, doubting truth. Okay, let's see. Ata, just 1 second, please. All right. So Ata, who's Ata? Ata ibn Abi Rabah, he said that this ayah, الَّذِينَ آتَيْنَاهُمُ الْكِتَابِ, the ones that we granted them the book, he said this is referring to when it was talking about الَّذِينَ آتَيْنَاهُمُ الْكِتَابِ right there in this ayah right here. Okay, he said this was referring to the major figures from the Prophet ﷺ's companions. So like who? Like Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, like Uthman, like Umar ibn al-Khattab, like Ali ibn Abi Talib. But, other mufassirin, they said, al-ibra bi'umum al-lafzi la bi-khusus al-sabab. It doesn't have to be specific to them, but it would actually include anybody that basically had taken the book that is the Quran and basically recognized that the truth that is within it, and they would take it in consideration. They would believe in it, what the sidq that is in it, basically the aqidah, and al-adl, basically the legislation, and they would be committed to the word. When you say la mubaddila li kalimatihi, this actually contains two things. La mubaddila li kalimatihi, meaning the words themselves are not to change, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not alternate and change the truth. That's number one. La mubaddila li kalimatih could also give the inference that the people are committed and they would not contradict what was revealed in the Quran in terms of kalimat. What kalimat? Let's look at this one. When you say la mubaddila li kalimatih, what kalima? The kalima of al-sidq and the kalima of al-adl. So for a person the inference is that if you believe in the words of the Lord Almighty, one, the kalimatain, the sidq, all the different words of truth and all the different words that contain within legislature, which is basically all the different details of legislation, that you would recognize that truth within it, then لا مبدل لكلماته, just as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not change the truth. And then the inference is you too should not basically go against the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because they would not change. Then you at the same time do not go against and bring about an alteration and an opposition to what the words of truth contain. He said, "Tammat kalimatu rabbik." In other qira'at, kalimatu rabbik. What's the difference between kalimatu, which is basically this one, as in Hafs and Asim, and kalimat? Kalimat means words, so it's basically in plural. Okay, and Ibn Abbas said when it was talking about kalimat or rabbik, this was talking about whether we're speaking about the statements or whether we're speaking about the promises, Jannah, hellfire, etc. And that was some interpretation. Other scholars said, no, this is talking about just in a general comprehensive statement that kalimat, meaning all the words of the Quran, are not going to be, number one, they're not made up and they would not be lessened. And therefore, it is in sidq. All the promises and all the things about Judgment Day that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had talked about, it is going to be something that will never change. As well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's promises, they'll never change. Nothing will object his judgment. Nothing will object his ordain and what he had ordained. And therefore, nothing will alter the plans. Okay, so therefore there's no change in what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ruled in, and in the words, basically, if anybody would, point out, well, how did it change that in the Jewish scriptures and the Christian scriptures, that they were changed, they were edited by the people, but the truth of the matter is that the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not change. The truth didn't change, but they had attempted, and certainly they thought by changing and re-editing the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that changes the facts. Doesn't change the facts. The facts are going to be still facts, and therefore the inference is also telling us that we would have to follow dalalat al-Quran. What is it, dalala? Dalala are basically the different implications and the different wordings, and certainly the different details within the Quran. Since you cannot change it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing can be concealed away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, the truth is what we should be taking. The truth is what we should be taking. So the truth should be followed by us, even if others had chosen to probably put the efforts to conceal it. وَإِن تُطِعْ أَكْثَرَ مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ. If you were to follow the majority of the people, meaning who? Who's it referring to? Al-Kuffar. يُضِلُّوكَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. They would distract you away from the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does that mean? How do they distract you away from the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Whether distract you away from recognizing truth or distract you away from applying it. They would, the majority would follow al-dhann. Now here's one thing. Notice here that here it was emphasizing dhann, and down in the other ayat it was going to tell you about al-hawa. Remember, there are three types of resources for knowledge. There's one, dhann, speculation, and there's al-hawa, which desires and all the different feelings that you probably get, and there's al-hidayah, basically al-wahy. Those are the resources. Okay, those are the resources. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting us know whether their resource was a dhann or whether we're speaking about al-hawa, all right, whether dhann or al-hawa, that those were going to be basically misguidance and that it was going to lead people away from the truth. And of course, وَإِنْهُمْ إِلَّا يَخْرُصُونَ. And this one's quite interesting because I know I did say, talked about, the different twigs or the different pieces from the tree that they might actually take to make those hay mats, okay? And certainly it was basically used and, it was giving us this metaphor type of thing. But at the same time, this one's quite interesting because some scholars actually said يَحْدِثُونَ or يُقَدِّرُونَ. What does that mean? So they were basically going back to the word dhann, and dhann is about speculation. So يَخْرُصُونَ would be certainly speculation, but they were having certain inspirations that were coming from shayateen. So it might seem like they were having a point and they were just basically either taqdeer, basically either their own evaluation, which they would think is based on studies, okay, or interpretation, which they would think is based on evidence, okay, or it would be some gut feeling that they might got, but a gut feeling is not an evidence. And that's the thing, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us, يَخْرُصُونَ, according to this interpretation, that it was referring to the dhann, the speculation that they were living in, and making it, appear like it was founded on evidence, when in reality it was more of their own gut feeling and their own taqdeer, just their own evaluation to things and not necessarily based on evidence. Okay. And certainly we did go in details in terms of, well, what does that look like? And what is the root of the verb kha, ra, sa? And we went in details with that one. No need to go into it again. So مَن يُضِلُّ عَن سَبِيلِهِ, whoever goes away from the path of the Lord Almighty. What is al-dalal? Al-dalal is to lose the direction. That's a dalal. So you're walking, but then all of a sudden you lose the direction and your destination becomes, you may recognize that you want to get to a certain destination, but then you lose your method to help you get to your goal. That's a dalal. You lose your method, you lose your piece of, map, or you may get into this moment where you're not really sure how to get to your destination. That's a dalal. Okay, that's a dalal. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inna rabbaka a'lamu, the Lord Almighty, who from the people, they're basically gone astray away from the path of the Lord Almighty. So the Lord Almighty, let's say, Inna rabbaka a'lam biman dhalla an sabilihi wa huwa a'lam bil muhtadin. Okay. And I think, was it Khadija that asked me this last time? And he said that some scholars actually read it in the present tense. Inna rabbaka huwa a'lam biman yudillu an sabilihi wa huwa a'lam bil muhtadin. Okay. So that was another qira'ah. Okay. If he said, if it was al-idlal huwa a'lam bil hadin, he didn't say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a'lam bil hadin. He wasn't talking about the people who are bringing guidance to others, but he was talking about those that were living in guidance. So this is it, inshallah. I guess learned a lesson. Don't want to go beyond our time too much. Okay. So subhanakallah wa bihamdika astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. If there are any questions, inshallah, I'd be happy to answer them. Let's see, we've got Balqis, didn't get her baby yet. We've got Jarai, Latifa, Matina, good job. Zoom, mashallah. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. Okay, no one wants to be on that